We continue on now to Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works in English translation and beyond. Now, once again, this week we have joining us in the studio cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Kolin의 한국, and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. And this week he has an as yet untranslated book, but one that has caused quite a stir. Let's bring him in now to find out more. Colin, hello. It's great to see you again.
Hi, John. Glad to be here.
Now, okay, I understand you brought today a new book from one of the most beloved writers in the history of South Korean literature.
Yes, and from a writer from whom few would have imagined we'd ever get another book. It's 사랑을 무게로 안 느끼게, the newly published essay collection from Park Wan-suh.
Right, so that is a surprise, given that the late Park Wan-suh has been gone quite some time now, hasn't she?
Right, she died back in 2011, by which time she'd long been a venerated figure in Korean letters. And by no means has the general enthusiasm for her work declined since then. For many of the latest generation of readers discovering her work, her famous novels like 남옥, 그만둔 시간은 누가 다 먹었을까, and 닮은 방들 provide a window onto what everyday life was like in a Korea they never knew, and indeed a Korea now slipping out of living memory.
Long-time listeners of the show and Korea Book Club will be familiar with Park Wan-suh. We've reviewed several of her works over the years already, and she has felt like such a force in Korean literature. She had such a formidable body of work that it's easy to imagine her having always been around, but actually she didn't get quite going until quite late in her career, right?
That's true. She published 남옥, her first novel, in 1970 when she was nearly 40 years old. And at that point, she'd lived through enough history for several lifetimes. We have to remember that when she was born in 1931, it was still the colonial period in Korea with no end in sight. And in fact, her birthplace, Gaepungun, is now part of North Korea, just on the other side of the border, what's now Kaesong. She was one of the many Koreans who effectively lost her hometown due to the division of the peninsula, and she later had to abandon her studies at Seoul National University due to the outbreak of the Korean War. And as for so many Koreans, her life at that time became a struggle for survival, but that experience would later become the dominant subject of her early novels.
Right, and she's certainly left an impression on the Korean literary world. Let's talk about this new book, 사랑을 무게로 안 느끼게. As we mentioned, it's only available in Korean. How would we translate it, do you think, Colin? Perhaps how not to feel the weight of love, something like that?
Yes, or you could get more poetic and say, lest love be a burden, or to make love not feel weighty, or so that love does not feel weighty. In a sense, to give love, and she's talking about her children in this novel, to love your children without them feeling as if it's a weight, as if it's a burden.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that it's not a novel, but a collection of essays. So what is she writing about? Is she writing about those harrowing chapters of her life that we mentioned earlier, or is it something else? You mentioned her children. What do we find here in this book?
Yeah, all kinds of things. She was known to write autobiographically in her fiction, but most clearly in her novels, like 그만둔 시간은 누가 다 먹었을까? But here, she draws all her material directly from her life. There's a 1991 essay in the book called 내가 걸어온 길, which will be valuable to any reader interested in contextualizing her work within her personal history. But it's also striking in this essay in that it shows how she could reflect upon the many misfortunes of her life, including the deaths of both her husband and son in the late 1980s, with an almost philosophical clarity and reflectiveness. You could say she set an example of how to think in a literary sense about painful events, whether those events occur on a familial scale or a national one. But as her longtime readers know, and as the variety of essays in 사랑을 무게로 안 느끼게 reminds us, she could handle light subjects with as much acuity as heavy ones.
Right, so that essay, 내가 걸어온 길, the path I've walked down,
Exactly,
I guess.
It's autobiographical, just the life she lived to that point, and it's retold not flatly so much as calmly, and she has a perspective you're surprised one could have after experiencing so much, and much of which was not so good.
It sounds fascinating, and it's interesting. Some listeners may well be very familiar with her as a novelist, but perhaps not as an essayist. as such. But of course, in Korean literature, we do find authors and writers dabbling in both. What else does she write about in the pieces collected in this new book?
Well, there are 46 essays in the book, one of them never before published. All of them originally written between the early 1970s and mid-1990s. So no matter what the era, she takes a diaristic approach, starting with a sometimes trivial-sounding observation from her daily life or from her travels or from current events, and finding her way to a consideration of larger human themes. So anything gets her writing. It could be the prices of vegetables at the Shijang or traditional urban market. It could be a marathon passing through the streets of Seoul, or the differences between the behavior of young boys and young girls and how they act around each other, or just doing the laundry her children bring home after a summer at the seaside. She also takes notice of changing fashions, whether it be the length of women's skirts or men's hair even. I found particularly memorable one essay in which she writes of having to share a crowded table at a dabang, or an old-style coffee shop with a bunch of scruffy youths, and while eavesdropping on their conversation, comes to realize that they're not antisocial rebels, they're just regular kids.
Right. It's quite a collection of essays and exploration of ideas and themes then. It sounds like it really helps the reader delve deep into her mind to get to know the author and the context of her writing better as well. And it seems there are quite a few topics there that you mentioned where she's thinking about the youth and young people in the changing times. It does seem that this is a topic that she is deeply interested in.
Judging by these essays, she had her eye on people young, old, and every age in between, but she did observe with a particular keenness her own children and their peers, as well as the dynamic between their generation and her own. So, in the book's title essay, 사랑을 무게로 안 느끼게, she briefly but poetically lays out what we might call her parenting philosophy. And as she explains, she does have hopes for her children, that they not become prematurely cynical, or that they appreciate music, art, and literature, that they be broad-minded, easygoing, that they not get snobbish if they're rich, and they not flaunt their knowledge if they're educated, that they can content themselves with humble lives if they're neither rich nor educated. But she also refuses to burden them by voicing these or other expectations to them, which makes for quite a contrast with the mothers around her, whom she criticized for their harsh, guilt-inflicting manner toward their own children.
Interesting. So it's a sort of rebuke against some of the parenting that she has seen.
Right, a direct rebuke as well. She tells you what she doesn't like.
Sure. And it's interesting about the burden, I guess, as you said, of love and giving too much to your children and putting that be too much of a burden on them. It sounds like she's wanted to relay her thoughts to the parents just as much as to the youth, it seems, or at least the older generation. But still, would you say that looking at the younger generations, Park Wan-suh was perhaps optimistic about the future of Korea? What do you think you read from her from her writing?
In a sense, yes. Everything she noticed around her seemed to have inspired her to consider where this society was going. And in some ways, you could say she was a woman ahead of her time. Not just in the way she raised her children, but in her attitude towards certain types of social change going on around her. Nevertheless, she didn't always see Korea as changing for the better. In her novels, she conveyed the privations of wartime and its aftermath with a vividness that's almost painful to read even today. But she was also unsparing in her criticism of the society that subsequently arose in the newly wealthy South Korea, especially what she saw as its disregard for traditional values and its vain, conformist middle class. Now, with her essays newly reprinted in this book, reviewers today have remarked on her surprisingly forthright, sometimes even cantankerous persona as a nonfiction writer. Korea may have become wealthy in her lifetime, but she never got complacent about the conditions in which she lived, nor hesitant in the least to speak her own mind.
Right, so you can see that she remained passionate throughout her life. That spark never seemed to dim, it seems.
A critical spirit, we could say.
Right, indeed. Because in a sense, then, the fact that the Korean society continues to change at this fairly rapid pace, I guess that means Park could remain relevant for years to come. Her works and her words will perhaps still be a way for us to look back and reflect on how things are changing, would you say?
I think so. The last book that collected Park Wan-suh's nonfiction came out in 2002, I believe, and so it was about time to publish a final definitive volume that consolidates her reputation as an essayist, in addition to her reputation as a novelist. And this is the book that does that, and I'd be remiss in not remarking on its elegant, almost retro design. They can't see it, the listeners, but you can see it here.
Sure.
The pages look good, too. It also has extra content, not just the essays, provided by Ho Won-suk, who is Park Wan-suh's daughter and the keeper of her legacy. There are photographs of Park Wan-suh herself with her family over the years, as well as some pages at the back that constitute a kind of exhibition of her possessions, showing us everything from her wristwatch and her radio to her manuscript pages and her pencil sharpener. They're artifacts, and you see them, they're artifacts from various eras, and they constitute what I think of as further proof that Park Wan-suh didn't just tell the story of South Korea in her novels, stories and essays. She lived it herself.
Sure. It sounds like an essential book to have for fans of Park, to get a deep understanding of her works and her thoughts, providing the context surrounding it, help us learn more about what was behind the writer as well, right?
I think so. It's hard to imagine a Park Wan-suh fan who wouldn't want to have all the essays collected here. Previous essay collections have been incomplete, or they're just hard to find now. But now we have a brand new one, and no one expected a new book from Park Wan-suh.
Sure. It's probably unlikely to get an English translation anytime soon, right? This type of book.
Anytime soon, no, because essays get translated less frequently. But
Sure.
Park Wan-suh is a well-known author in translation. I mentioned one of her novels in Korean, but there's an English translation called Who Ate Up All the Shinga. That's a well-known book among people who know Korean literature in English. So if any author is going to have translated essays anytime soon, I would guess Park Wan-suh is a good candidate for that, a promising candidate.
Right, it will be a fascinating, I think, study for any Korean literature lovers out there as well. I think this book would be a good companion piece to a book that we mentioned previously as well on this show. I think it was by her daughter, which is talking about her recollections of her mother, particularly in the kitchen as well. I think that would have been a good companion piece to this. So once again, this book is called 사랑을 무게로 안 느끼게 by Park Wan-suh, currently only available in Korean. And that's all for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, it's been great to have you with us once again, and we look forward to the next one. Till then, take care.
I look forward to coming back. Thank you very much, Sang-ho.
And that's where we end our show for today. Join us again tomorrow when we'll have the final results of the 22nd general elections. We'll also further dissect all the fallout and the ramifications. Till then, we hope you have a great day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.